basically, we also just released this book, The Map is Indestructible, which is basically kind of arguing what I think is, I would basically say is for me always been the key problem of epistemology in general, which is the problem of internally consistent systems. And that basically is just the idea that most people are not operating with clearly false notions. They're operating with a system of premises that don't contradict and yet don't necessarily correspond. But the problem is nobody necessarily knows if their map corresponds or not because that would require certainty, right? So people are operating in internally consistent, we can also put it this way, interpretations of situations, right?
Yeah.
And basically what Javier was bringing up, and I'm just thinking about this constantly just with life in general, because I basically think global pluralism is doomed for World War III if we can't deal with this problem, is that everyone has an internally consistent interpretation of what happened. And therefore, the other person should apologize. And I really should not talk to them until they apologize because they won't change. They're not open, right? And there's kind of this idea of, some people, well, there's no need to talk to them because it's obvious the example that Javier was making. This person is obviously emotionally cheating. They are emotionally invested in someone else outside a relationship. And it's all the signs see it. But nobody actually talks to the person, right? But why would you talk to the person? Because they're too close. Because people always have a logic, right? That person is too close to the situation to see it clearly. So it wouldn't even matter if you went and asked them their view because they can't see it, right? So you need to go to other people. But there's all sorts of tension. So in Christianity, there's something called gossip, and gossip is really bad. And I've never met anyone who gossips. Everyone is just trying to figure out what's going on by talking to a bunch of people, right? Likewise, no one is unforgiving. They're being wise about not interacting with dangerous people, right? I really don't think we've done enough, perhaps. Nobody thinks they're doing Nobody thinks they're doing the things that they know they shouldn't do, right?
Mm.
Nobody thinks that they're gossiping. They may kind of say, I know we shouldn't gossip, and then proceed to continue doing it because they're gathering information. Nobody, thinks around things like, I know I shouldn't be upset, but this person did X, Y, and Z, and continue with it. And all of this is the logic of internal consistency, where it's maintaining a certain consistency that whatever you do is kind of justified because you have a premise that makes it okay. And we all, as human beings, seem naturally trapped in these internally consistent systems. You can't the other key claim of the map is indestructible is that maps are indestructible, meaning you can't get rid of them. And maps are internally consistent systems. That's what I mean by maps. Well, if you can't destroy them, then this problem of internal consistency, always being able to interpret situation in light of your understanding, that's not going away. And since we can't get rid of maps, and yet the problem is maps, how do we go beyond maps when we can't go beyond maps, right? Well, it would seem as if we need to collide maps. We need internal consistent systems to hit one another. But this is more and more where I'm just on the side of Seth's work, your work, on the ability of the nervous system to handle encounter, the ability to be able to face difficulty. I'm basically at the point where it just seems like the most important organization on planet Earth. So Seth, tell me what you think of this. Is basically one that has we teach one thing: how to face people you hate, how to face people you really don't want to face, and to be able to do it well. I increasingly feel as if the world is doomed if we can't do this. This is the key capacity for global pluralism, for politics, for life, and an organization that was dedicated entirely to that, the skill of facing the other, seems like the most important organization on planet Earth. And it would require us to do nervous system, the question of forgiveness. Forgiveness is such a crazy question, right? We all say forgive. Okay, well, what about, the book, The Sunflower? Should the Jew forgive the Nazi? Well, that seems problematic. But then it also seems problematic not to. This is a massive issue. I've been thinking about all of this a lot because it's at the heart of the problem of internally consistent systems. And also, I would argue, if we can't do this, then we close instead of open. And if we close, we don't get the gestalt. We don't get the geometry. We don't get the authentic resonance. Everything we've talked about in terms of the system is gone. The system, the cybernetic system of human relations, in order to afford everything we've talked about, requires human beings to open. They have to be able to be open. But does that mean they're open under any and all possible circumstances? Well, doesn't that mean you're going to be killed by someone that takes advantage of you? Well, that's why everyone closes down and we get World War III, right? So the stakes are really high to this problem, and I just continue to go on it. So I thought I'd throw it at you fine people.
Yeah, you have to be able to acknowledge and tolerate the rage that you're going to feel to face that other, right? And that sounds very simple, but there's lots of components to that. And I think the internally consistent systems that people get trapped in, they actually function. They are built up over time as a wall to keep oneself from being able to notice and tolerate rage towards the other. And then if we take it a step further, it's really about being able to notice and tolerate rage without needing to cut off or split off from the other, what we would call positive feelings, the love that you would feel to the idea being that you would feel towards your fellow human, and to be able to hold both things together without needing to automatically flip into the overthinking, the rationalization, the redirection, all of these moves that we do, or the complete avoidance, the exiting, the wanting to stay shut off and not approach. So that is, I mean, that is essentially at the heart of the kind of therapy that I do. That is exactly what we're doing. And that's really what it boils down to. But it's, my mind's going in many different directions because this links beautifully with things that I've been thinking about. In a similar vein, I would say more inspired by the conversation you had, Daniel, with Thomas Jochen about health. And there was some discussion in there about the role of memory, and how all of this links, I think, to what the three of us have been talking about with authentic resonance.
Yeah.
You know, attunement to the signal inside us as the guide, and that actually our ability to do that requires us also to have the capacity to be with the intensity of our feelings, all of them, our emotional state. So doing all this work sort of stacks on top of each other. Those are just my initial thoughts, though. Please, Seth, jump in.
Well, I've been thinking about a lot of these things too, and I think I've really been appreciating. I'm just going via YouTube. I don't have the book, but I have been listening through some of the pieces on The Map is Indestructible. And it's funny because a lot of what I notice is happening in OG Rose, and this is also true in the conflict of mind, is there's just a series of, in your writing, you're walking through, here's why we get into this trap, and here's why we get into this trap. And if we take any of those individual situations, I can kind of listen and nod my head and say, yes, that's true. But they start to pile up.
Yes.
They really start to pile up. I mean, even just the natural, what I get from the conflict of mind is even before we get to society, there's just certain things that are, I guess, our biology or our instinct does in cognition that we really have to be on the lookout for because they can steer us, at least in today's world, in directions that turn out not to be so good. But there are certain moments when I listen to the elucidation of all the contradictions and all the problems where you kind of go, oh, so are we screwed? But what I notice is the more I listen, the more I start to see those problems like sooner after they come over the horizon. They don't have to come right up into my face before I catch, oh, this is what I'm doing. I am, for example, you talk about how if we have a theory of something and we come up with a new theory, it might really help us to explain something, but then we'll really get to know the theory really well, especially if we think it's a good one. Then we start seeing the theory in action everywhere. Whereas maybe it's helpful, but it could be a blinder. It could also just literally change our behavior because now something's been explained. So the theory explains something about people who don't know the theory, but now that we know the theory, we act differently. So I'm going through that, and I mean, I suppose through my own experiences, I'm kind of drawing the same conclusion as what you began with. Like, we have to learn how to face the other. And I think that Aspasia, I think you said there's the terror of doing that. And I think that's very real. And just one other piece I want to add, though, is part of the terror is cognitive dissonance. So, Daniel, when you talk about the non-rational, like to forgive someone is non-rational because they actually did that bad thing to me, and like actually, you know, I shouldn't be happy about people doing bad things to me. So when I forgive them, it feels irrational. So that's how you've defined, you know, the non-rational, is that it feels irrational. It might be different than irrationality, because it turns out if I forgive this person, we might actually clean up our relationship and move forward towards something better. We might actually get out of this kind of pit that we've fallen into. But there, even if, so part of the obstacle might be my willingness to forgive this person. It might be my willingness to have an open heart and all of those kinds of things. But there's also just an aspect where if I try to calculate, is this actually going to lead to something better? I might not be able to believe that ahead of time either. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, I suppose that I can imagine myself forgiving them, but then if they do the same thing again, that will just show that forgiveness isn't actually the mechanism that I thought it was. And I think what is what's hopeful here is we know that all kinds of people go through transformational change in their lives. Probably anyone listening, just think about how you saw the world 10 years ago versus now. Like we all shift, and there are things that we take for granted, or we think of as literally true, that later we realize, oh, that was how I saw things then. But if you think of how you got to your previous worldview to the worldview you currently hold, there has to be a moment that feels like stepping off the diving board, you know, the high dive for the first time. It's like, I am just going to step out into space, and I literally don't know what's going to happen. And so I think, yes, we need that organization, but the marketing campaign of that organization is going to be really challenging, because it's like, hey, try something that scares the shit out of you. Try something that doesn't seem to make any sense. In fact, try something that contradicts everything that you have previously thought to be true. And I do think that it's possible to get there. Maybe we stumble into this, or maybe, you know, you're working with a therapist or a coach or just a good friend who has been through the situation you're in, who suggests to you, why don't you try the opposite thing of what you've ever done before? Just trust me. And maybe if you trust that person, you say, this makes no sense, but just once, you know, I'm going to do this thing. But it really is, so that's the thing I kind of want to zero in on, is that feeling of this is irrational. And there's also the courage, but I think they're two slightly different but related things. So I wanted to highlight that.
Can I just quickly? I know you've got something coming, Daniel. I think the bit that people often miss is that what scares the shit out of you, and what can feel so, I guess, irrational, or about the idea of facing another person who has hurt you and continuing to try and remain connected to them, is, in fact, when we really look at it, it's what's happening inside of you. So it's actually the terror of the the emotional response you are having to being hurt. And that's what I mean about our capacity to notice that inside and hold it without believing that we're going to act it out. So normally what comes, and if we trace this developmentally, normally what comes when somebody hurts us, especially someone we care for or we rely on, is an intense rage that would want to reach out and hurt or kill someone. That's just the kind of biological impulse. That it's a pretty crude impulse. And if we have never learned to be able to notice that, talk about that, have that normalized, find out that we have that within us, noticing it in the moment doesn't mean that we're going to do it, right? That difference between if we've not learnt that in our lifetime, and instead we've actually had the opposite done to us, where that's been monsterized, or for whatever reasons we had to push that way underground, which is most of us. What happens is when we're faced with this other person who is hurting us in adulthood, it starts, so we notice that we feel hurt, and then the feelings towards the other person are anger. We feel angry. Now, how well do we know our own anger? How well can we tolerate it inside? How fully do we experience it inside? Is going to determine how long we can stay connected with that person without believing that we're actually going to kill them, as an example, right? And so if we really look, there is a cutoff point. This is where the anxiety comes in. The anxiety floods us because it's the final warning bells that are saying, get out of the situation. This anger is being activated within you. This is bad. This is going to lead you to, do something that puts you in jail, that, whatever it is, that kills another person that you might also love, that you depend on, violates your moral code. The anxiety is just this final signal that is obscuring this feeling that's coming up because you've never learned to be able to have it fully inside, and also is making you so uncomfortable you want to get out of the situation, which will then, by getting out of the situation, reduce that emerging feeling of anger. So it works like that. And so I think often what happens is what scares the shit out of a person when they start to try and confront this is that they have to face what it actually happens inside me, and what do I notice if I stop and pay attention and try to cut through and ignore the anxiety layer and really notice this feeling that is coming up inside me. What does it want to do with my hands? What does it want to do with my feet? What do I notice in my jaw? What does this feeling really want? What's the impulse that comes with it? And until you can experience that inside completely and notice that you actually have more control over your ability to either act or not act on that in that moment, because the anxiety goes away. That's what I mean. Once you fully experience it in your body, that anxiety layer disappears. That's the bit that makes us feel edgy and impulsive and like we're not sure if we're going to do bad things or what we should do, or we're clear-minded because we don't have the anxiety. We're clear-minded and we notice that there is this primal instinct in us, this warm feeling reaching down to our hands that notices, by being hurt by this person who I also trusted, I just notice in my hands this impulse to reach out and strangle them, if we put it in simple terms. It's just an impulse. It's a primal thing inside me. I'm glad it's there if I ever needed it, but I'm not going to act on it, right? It's just and that's where the noticing bit is really important. Our ability to tolerate and notice this happening inside, but also notice there are other parts to us, right? That we're not going to act on that. We also have a moral code. We also love this person, all these things. And that actually we can feel calm and confident to notice that within us. Then a lot of the this terror that I talk about falls away, because we notice that part of what's so scary about interacting with people deeply is that we come to trust them and care for them, and they will hurt us, they will disappoint us. And when those things happen, the particularly scary bit is not that feeling of hurt. It's the responsive emotion we feel towards them for having hurt us, for having let us down, for not being the perfect ideal other that we all want, right? Not being the, magical parent figure. And so once we can notice, wow, that really hurt, and look at this anger that comes up inside me that wants to hurt them in response. If we can, those are still like, intense feelings. I don't mean to imply that this is all very calm and meditative, but once you can do that enough, that anxiety is being taken out of the equation. We don't feel all anxious and tense around it and jittery, or we're not running to exit, or we don't go. The other thing that happens too is there's anxiety, but also for lots of people, they've developed really amazing cognitive defenses where they go into this rationalization we're talking about, or this meaning making of all the reasons why I always knew this about this person and I should just have nothing to do with them and cut off forever. And or we go into projection. They're the scary person. Look how angry they are at me. If I can, they're going to hurt me, we start to really focus on their continuation of hurting us rather than notice the impulse inside us that might want to reach out and hurt them. To notice that we are all capable of having an impulse inside to reach out and hurt one another. It's animalistic. Now we need to use our whole brain and body to figure out what we're actually going to do with that set of feelings. But the part of the terror, I guess the bit I'm trying to point to is that part of the terror in all of this is the terror of noticing who we are in our entirety and everything we are capable of. And that this horrible thing this person's doing to me right now, I probably have done that in my lifetime. I'm perfectly capable of doing the same thing. It's also a mirror thing. It's a not wanting to acknowledge. And so for lots of people, yes, it does become this kind of projective process and I'm all good and they're the bad person. But it can go a million different ways. It can also be the very passive person who takes everything on board that, oh, I deserved that. It is all my fault. I am a bad person. They should be hurting me. This is another way of not being allowed to own one's anger. So instead we crush down into shame and passivity. And then there's, that's another form of what I would call distortion that's going on emotionally. We are not in touch with what I would call the primary emotional reactions to that moment and that relationship. And these patterns all get set up very, very young, right? Hence the kind of psychoanalytically informed way that we deal with it, because this all comes about from usually early attachment relationships, and then just kind of gets doubled down over time. Our brain is amazing. Our bodies are amazing. They can also learn very wonderful, nuanced ways to ensure that we never get close to those very scary, terrifying feelings ever again. But it's mostly the impulse that's terrifying. It's not usually the sensation in the body, although lots of people are cut off from that as well. It's the impulse that comes with it. And so forgiveness is I think, relevant here, because often too, part of the forgiveness is a self-forgiveness, a noticing I have the capacity, and I notice inside me a whole network that fires off that would want to reach out and hurt someone physically, right? And can I accept that and not make that a marker of, I guess, my value as a person, like if I'm good or bad, right? That instead it's actually about how I choose to act in response to noticing that inside me. And most people don't make that distinction. And then there's a whole lot of stuff in Catholicism we could talk about there too, I think. But so, I mean, I could go on and on. I could go on and on. So what am I trying to get to? So the forgiveness. So I think part of the forgiveness conversation here is that actually once someone is sufficiently acquainted with their anger and their rage impulse that I'm talking about to this degree, what usually follows is that they come to experience guilt over the rage. So then they actually get acquainted with their feelings of guilt that they have held for a very long time underground, because when you're very young, you're not able to make that distinction between impulse and real world action, as well as when you're older. I mean, most people when they're older can't do it very well either. But when you're young, it really is confused. And if no one helps you to sort of disentangle that, it's almost like for the child, they believe it's almost like they've done it, to notice that there's this burst of energy in them that wants to reach out and hurt their parent, right? In response to just not getting something they wanted. It's normal, but if it doesn't get normalized, this is what happens. And so the child can then learn to have a very tortured relationship with guilt. Guilt can be weaponized in all sorts of ways by parents as well. So there's that additional layer. And I think guilt goes hand in hand with forgiveness. So I just want to throw that in there too, that I suspect that with the forgiveness piece, once we've done some of this work on the anger side of things, I think the question around forgiveness might not seem so complicated anymore, because a lot of what complicates it is this whole and sort of internally consistent intellectualized system that we're talking about. It's this top layer that's really a defense. And again, a lot of that falls away and is not needed when we can just feel more clearly. Our actions become more obvious to us. It becomes obvious to us that, of course, I'm not actually going to strangle this person. And actually, I can also notice my loving feelings at the same time, and it just becomes easier to decide what we want to do. And that's probably where the authentic resonance piece comes in, that I've always been curious about how we do that next bit. But also, I think forgiveness is tied to, again, perhaps a projective process where we are thinking about whether or not we will forgive someone else, when part of what's going on is an avoidance of noticing a need to really acknowledge and forgive and accept within oneself that when they did that to me, I also had this impulse to hurt them. And actually, this is our shared humanity. They've treated me poorly. I know I'm able to do that to the other. Being a human in relationship is hard. It's really hard. And actually, once you come face to face with that, you're more likely to feel compassion and love and shared humanity. And these are the things that help us to maneuver more towards staying in connection and trying to work it out, if that's what we mean by forgiveness. And yes, there's also a time when we need to learn to be able to say no more in a certain relationship. But I think they're all tied to the same thing underneath.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate everything that everyone is saying. And Seth, thank you so much for looking through those playlists of the book. It means a lot. And a hope is that you see and then you go, oh, I recognize that, and that there is some sort of just that seeing the pattern. Because, you mentioned the talk with Jonathan, and we talk all the time about how seeing the pattern seems to be very important for living life. Because a pattern you don't see is a pattern that if you're in, you start living out, and then you're entrapped and you can't get out of it, right? And then part of what Jochen is pointing to is health is tied to our ability to see certain patterns or to handle the stress of breaking out of the pattern. And if we can't do that, we end up in trouble. And I've been speaking with the map is indestructible. More and more, I increasingly see life almost as if there are little whirlpools or internally consistent systems or patterns as you're going along. And if you get in, you're stuck. You could be here for 40 years. You break out and then there's another and you could be stuck here, right? Like if you take seriously the problem of internally consistent systems, then we're surrounded by patterns or forms that if we're not careful, we end up in one. And then it becomes the lens by which we see reality through. And once you get in a pattern, especially a self-effacing pattern, a self-destructive pattern, it makes itself invisible. All maps make themselves invisible. They're not maps, they're isness. They are a monster. It's not my opinion, they are a monster, or this is the wrong thing to do. It becomes isness. And that leads to a lot of issues. As a kind of question, I am more and more seeing basically this issue as if this is not addressed, nothing else really matters. Everything else that is accomplished or done will collapse. All efforts, all work, rather to improve democracy, to improve organizations, relationship, it will not matter. Maybe you'll have 5 good years or 10 or 20, but eventually the day will come when this problem arises, it is not properly addressed, and it breaks. That's my opinion. Do we agree on the extremity of that claim? Not to put you on the spot, that's where I'm kind of at.
Yes.
We think so. I agree. I think there are also levels. If this problem is not addressed, then people will, quote unquote, isolate. They'll separate, right, in some form or another. If they separate and isolate, then it is possible for them to, in that isolation, find belonging and meaning and gestalt and authentic resonance and flow in that isolated system that they make with people who will go into isolation with them. The reason why I say this is because there's a true terror in all this. Kind of following, I want to say, Christian metaphysic that I think is true. The more wonderful the thing you create, the more horrific the terror it creates if it goes afoul. So the more dynamic, and the reason why I say this, because what I think is this problem we are describing is the encounter with otherness. And if we can't handle this problem, people will isolate, and they may actually go off and live a wonderful life with meaning, belonging, and flow, and maybe they'll be very successful. But then a day will come along when it encounters otherness again, and this problem will reemerge. And I would argue that when two groups encounter that are very developed, the damage is actually strongly multiplied, actually, big time, right? So basically, I'm also suggesting that all of the positive things that we have talked about, or maybe the entire online space has been talking about, could actually invert into their opposite in a destructive fashion if the people who gain those lessons have not learned this lesson. Because when it inverts, all of those good things will actually make it way worse. It's the idea Lucifer is the highest angel, right? And, that is what falls. So for me, that's also the stakes of all this, because I think sometimes I'm of the opinion, the more, like, I think a lot of the online spaces or conversations that many people have had are absolutely what people need for meaning, belonging, and to be fully human. Completely agree. But I actually think all of those things invert into their opposite and magnify the horror if this issue is not addressed. And I also think this issue, well, it is all about the address of global pluralism. Because ultimately, if the atheist, the Christian, is all these different people encounter, which they are, then if this will arise, and now we have massive conflict, maybe World War III, who knows what, right? And so also, since this, what's so interesting about this problem of anger, the phenomenology of anger, and I know we've talked about it before, Aspasia, I am of the opinion that this very problem that is, and I think, Seth, we talked about it, this very problem that is happening in the household is actually isomorphically the same as the problem on geopolitical. Like, it's actually the same, the very problems of the household are actually the exact same problems of a different complexity and system, of course, but they're actually the exact same problem when it comes to global politics. I get that impression from studying diplomacy. I've always talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I always talk about foreign embassies and different things. When you read how much of history is actually determined by the willingness or unwillingness of people to talk to one another, then I think it becomes very clear how what we are describing here actually determines basically the fate of the world. And of course, every day of the week, why do you stop talking with that other country? They're monsters. They're bad people. If we talk with them, we enable them. They've done horrible things, right? Now, I find that very interesting because to say something very, to what you were saying, Aspasia, when you study, and I'm not saying I'm an expert on every nation on planet Earth, I'm not, but when you read history, you see that every single nation is pretty terrible. They've all done terrible things. And so there's also this idea of avoiding one's own self-reflection to sort of see, right? Say, well, they're monsters, we're not going to talk with them. Perhaps when Nietzsche said, be careful to fight with monsters before you become a monster, that's true, but also be careful to avoid monsters, because that also makes a monster too. And so this problem, I like also, there's many things to say, because I basically think that if a grassroots movement needs to occur, it's like a grassroots movement of training everyday people in this capacity, like one by one by one by one. And if this capacity is not there, then there is actually an argument to be made. All of the positive things that are being taught or learned actually will just become in service of internally consistent systems that will not actually help make the world a better place. In the name of helping make the world a better place, you've simply intensified the horror of the failure when people's anger overcome them. That's a dismal thing to say, but I do think it's only saints that become demons. It is only those who ascend that actually have. So to me, this is very large. I like what was said on anxiety as a sign of anger coming. I think basically also there's just simply an assumption that kind of learning a better metaphysic, maybe a better ontology, a better epistemology, different skills, that means you actually become as a person better at handling emotions, better at handling anger, when they may not actually relate necessarily. That's why it's also very important to have a philosophy that is coming back to the concrete and the encounter of the other and facing them, right? I am also thinking about forgiveness, something I have, it's almost like what you were saying there, Aspasia. It's almost like forgiveness is tied to facing the other as one who you could be like. Like in the act of forgiveness, you're facing them as one that you could be like, right? Well, what if they bombed your nation? What if they killed your child, right? Like, that's quite a thing. What does it mean to see in the one who killed your child yourself as someone who could kill their child? Is this too much of an ask? Is this just simply too much of an ask? If it's too much of an ask, then maybe we're doomed, because nations will rage, right? Um, but it seems like it has to be addressed. Um, I am also wondering if forgiveness, if maybe we've thought about the problem of, and I know I'm just throwing out like very high stakes things this evening because I
Go
think
for it.
these
I'm
are
loving
very,
this. This is great.
you know,
Yeah.
because, and I think it's tied to health. I think it's tied to authentic resonance because I also think, Seth, I was just going to comment, there is a difference between this feels irrational and courage. I will also note that to say something, usually people don't view their actions as being fearful. There's a very good reason why they're not being courageous. It's because doing that's irrational. It's because they're monsters and talking to them would be bad or something, right? So there's also an interesting thing where there's the great problem that when I say to people, and this is what I mean, where all the things that we're teaching or talking about online or whatever could actually reverse. When we say to people, it's very important to be, courage is key. Many people could hear that and say, absolutely, I'm courageous, and just happen to never face that person because that person's stupid. That's not a matter of courage. That's they're evil or something, right?
Or it takes courage to decide to not have anything to do with
Yes,
them.
that's
That's the
right. You
other
could just spin it.
story.
That's the problem of internal consistency. You can just spin it forever, right? So how do you discern when you are acting wisely to avoid the person and when you're just saying that, right? It seems like it has to be in the body. It seems like it has to be, the body has to keep the score, as that old idea goes. The body has
Authentic
to
resonance.
be,
This is
it has to be
authentic
authentic
resonance.
resonance and in the antenna. I am wondering, I guess what I was pointing to, do we perhaps too much ask is forgiveness in the mind? Maybe forgiveness is something the body does, not the mind. All you need to do is choose to face them and not ask, like to just bring yourself where you can handle facing them and choosing to face them and let the body do the rest. Maybe part of the issue is forgiveness is not something you can. Let me put it this way, because there's one sense in which you do want to forgive the person, and since you want to let go of the anger, you don't want to have hatred, right? But then there's another way in which if you go, how can I forgive that person because they genuinely did something terrible to me? When there's like different layers to this, at some point it seems like you just have to go, I can't choose it, but I can choose to put myself in their presence or to face them and believe that that activity will somehow change the body in the right way. I don't know how, I don't know why, but I'm just going to put myself in that place of facing, and the body forgives, not the mind,
Yes.
almost. Not to make a dualism, but
Yes.
it's like, it seems like if you ask the question, do I forgive or do I not forgive, you just get stuck.
Yes.
You get to at a certain point in that conversation, you get stuck, right? Um, Maybe at that point, the act of forgiveness is the willingness to face, the willingness to put yourself in the place where you feel that anger and have to go through the struggle of not acting on it, doing all the stuff you were saying. And that is the act of forgiveness, to just undergo that anger, because it would be much easier to just not face the person or face that conversation or to deal with your nervous system, right? Maybe that is the willingness to do that, to do it again and to do it continually. And maybe that is the act of forgiveness at that point, right?
Yes.
These are live thoughts. There is more to say, but I will stop there.
I'll say one brief thing and then I will, because I'd love to hear what you've got to say, Seth. So it is. I think that is really beautifully said. I think that's why I get stuck in this conversation when people used to talk about forgiveness in this cognitive way, like as though it's a sort of deeply philosophical question. Well, philosophical is wrong. A deeply sort of cognitive question, and we sit and we think about it, and we, yes, of course, you can do that, and that can be useful. But I really do think emotionally, once you're able to do this holding off, the anger, but it's also the complexity of feelings. So it's also not trying to over prioritize the anger to replace also noticing the positive, loving feelings. Once you can hold both together, and so some of the struggle here will be in these situations you described, Daniel, a person being able to find and get in contact with any kind of positive, loving feelings towards this person as well as the anger. And the recognition of our follied humanness that is shared between all of us may be the thing that might be able to help us always find some sense of love towards a fellow human being. Holding those two things together is generally the thing that I find it becomes quite straightforward to a person based on their own authentic resonance and will in that moment. It becomes quite straightforward to them what they want to do, whether or not they can sort of do the things that look like forgiveness or not. It's not difficult to discern that. The difficulty of discerning is when we go up here and avoid all that's going on in the body and the feelings and the holding the complexity of feelings, and we start to, and this is actually being driven because it functions to keep that push down. But we think it's the other way around. We almost think we're purposely choosing to go up here because, right? But it's actually this kind of automatic system where we find ourselves in the sort of sitting down, thinking through forgiveness as this big cognitive activity. So yes, and then the one other brief note is the way that I think about hate, which is not unique to me, but in the ways that I work, is that hate is the over prioritization of anger, holding on to anger to the point that we're doing it to avoid the complexity of feelings, right? So anger is not hate, but hate is kind of a defense of holding on to anger to avoid having to tolerate the complexity of also noticing the other feelings, is how I look at it. So yes, anyway, Seth, love to hear what's happening for you.
Well, I think, we're talking about all these things that feel really difficult. And so one question might be like to step back, how do you even do something difficult? I mean, I think that one of the prerequisites for any of this is a kind of a radical personal responsibility. So if I walk into a room with a bunch of people and something goes wrong, when I walk out of that room, no matter what everyone else did, I really have to ask, what did I do? Could it be that I could have done something differently? Or, can I take that attitude with me before I walk into the room? And although I think we should be careful with the question of authentic resonance here, because when I'm in my whirlpool, when I'm in my own map, what I think is authentic resonance is the resonance of this map. And I mean,
Seth?
and I think
I'm gonna call that faux-authentic resonance.
Faux-authentic.
We've got to bring all the terms. Please keep going.
Well, we have to keep, building a lot of vocabulary that only the three of us understand.
Makes it
That's
fun.
what makes this such a, specialized little whirlpool.
Yeah.
But I think it's really real that, that the body has to do it. I mean, we're all trained in whatever we're trained in. We have the patterns that make sense to us. And so if you don't know any better, you're going to go with what you know. But maybe if you do what you think is best practice repeatedly and you continue to have bad results, you can at least begin to question your own sort of principles or worldview or assumptions. And I think that's kind of the place I was trying to get to, where it really feels irrational. It's like, I have a better time when I stay at home, because at home, I get to control everything and it's comfortable, and I don't have to, encounter the fact that people are going to talk about subjects I don't know how to talk about. And so I'm definitely not going to go to the party because it'll be so awkward. And then when I stay home, it's like, yeah, good. I didn't have to deal with, at a certain point, I'm going to have to realize that despite the fact that I feel safer by not interacting with others, maybe I should do the most frightening thing of all, and go immerse myself with a bunch of people I don't know. And I think when I make that decision, there might be a voice in my head screaming at me, what the hell are you doing all the way over there? But the real thing that I have to do first is put on my shoes. And then I have to, walk out the door. I have to start the car. I have to drive it across town. And that really is the body. And it's kind of like, I have to be willing. like I wrote something once where I was kind of making it into a metaphor, where I was just sort of talking about how we do this to ourselves. But the metaphor was like I'm driving a car and there's a backseat passenger,
Yeah.
and they're screaming at me. And I just have to actually learn how to drive the car while the backseat passenger says, "What the hell are you doing? No, you're driving, the wrong way," and all of this. And you have to actually be willing to, I think at a certain point, roll the dice and pretend that I could have actually been completely wrong about everything. Now, I'm making this kind of dramatic, but I did want to bring in that example though of like I feel socially awkward. Now I'm going to actually go around other people, because I think that's a little actually less of a severe situation than the "you wronged me and I'm going to forgive you," right? I think forgiveness is maybe one of the most extreme non-rational moves. But let's say I'm an entrepreneur and I'm doing everything that I was taught to do in my business training, and I'm somehow not having the results, and then someone says, "Do exactly the opposite of what you learned in your business training." And that sounds really scary. Well, why would I do the opposite of what all of these, high-level people who apparently are successful told me to do? And yet I might try it if I'm desperate enough because I haven't managed to make their techniques work for me, right? And it is a sort of a classic thing. It's just like, every self-help book in the world says, "Here's how I transform my life. You can do it too." The problem is the author is a different person, And so you can read self-help books, and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm just like not like any of these people." And you define that as, I can't do what they did, but actually maybe I need to do the exact opposite of what worked for them, or something like that. And so what can even happen is that signal. I think you said this before, Aspasia, I need to get out of here. I actually need to learn how to hear that and say, "Oh, that means I need to stay."
Yeah.
I have to recognize that is the voice of my old patterning that wants to keep me inside of my map. And maybe I'm not thinking my map, but if I've reached a point where my map really doesn't feel like a nice place to live, if the territory that I've mapped with this map doesn't feel that way, and I think if we turn back to what Daniel's asking about, I mean, I could say, if everyone was like me and Aspasia and Daniel, we'd be having a good time in this culture. But then it's not my fault, right? And I have, but at a certain point, I have to say something doesn't feel right out there. What am I doing about it? And there's just no other. So and it could be that we cultivate something with our friends. I mean, we could go to the net, and maybe there's a dozen people on the call, and we can cultivate something there. But if we're not ready for someone new to walk in and join, and someone new and someone new and someone more different than the last different person who came in, I mean, I think it's kind of, I mean, it's a very tall order. But it's funny. I was just writing something that's not quite finished, but because I've been thinking about listening a lot, deep listening. And when I say the phrase deep listening, part of what I'm thinking of is what I'm doing with my body, and really can I refine perception in different ways. But it's also, it's those little subtle signals that make me hear, I need to get out of here, and that's like an actual order that I need to follow, versus I need to get out of here, and that's I don't know, the Luciferian voice or whatever. I need to be able to listen to the vibrations that are happening in my body moment by moment, and I need to be able to relate them out into space. I need to be able to relate what I'm feeling in my chest to the expression on your face. And there's still no rational in the sense of anyone would logically draw the same conclusion, but I have to I have to learn how to trust the unknown, like the way that a surfer trusts the waves, or, and then they'll still end up wiping out every once in a while. But I'll just end it here. But the thing I'm writing, the basic kind of thesis of it is to really listen, is to dissolve my ego. So long as I want to be the same person a minute from now, I can't fully listen to what you have to say. And that's a really tall order. And I know that, I resist that all the time. But in the moments where I have had an experience with someone where, let's say, I just have a very superficial first impression that proves itself to be very wrong, including in the positive direction, like, wow, I wasn't so sure about this person. Oh my gosh, they ended up being wonderful. And, I was sad when we had to go our separate ways because I enjoyed the conversation so much. If I can notice, wow, my initial read was completely off. And the thing is, my read 10 minutes in is pretty off as well. I have to sort of, there's something here that if I say it sounds in my own ears like I'm saying something a little too simple. I think maybe the nuance is that we have to renew it moment by moment by moment.
Yes. No, not simple at all. I think that's actually what we do to some of these ideas. We say that's too simple, but it's beautiful, Seth. I think this bit links to me to the memory piece and sort of the health of our memory, because I think what you're describing, if I'm going to crudely try and put it together, is so we need to be able to first of all be aware that we have maps, right? That they're maps. And that there is a link here, our map, and the sort of expectations that populate our calculating mind from moment to moment about what is likely to happen here and what I'm seeing in this person's face and what that means about what they're thinking and feeling and what I need to do. Like all of those assumptions and expectations and calculations that go on are going to be related to our memory, how we've coded and made meaning out of the times we've been in a relationship before, right? And we need to be aware that the health of that is going to vary widely, and that for most people there's going to be, that's what I call distortion. There's going to be distortion in that, and it's not going to be the healthiest or maybe representation of things. And so I think what you're describing there, Seth, that actually a really nice, practical, concrete way that we can talk to people about ways they can play with this for themselves is to just think about noticing that sort of internal monologue that feels very certain, that's really kind of like someone reading out the instructions of the map, it's kind of like GPS, like, telling you, right? We need to hear that, be aware of what the sort of the phenomenology of that, see that as, well, that might be my map talking to me that's based on a whole sort of memory system that might be a bit askew. If I try and just do the complete opposite, that's one way of playing with this idea and seeing what new information I can gather, right? To not just, I guess what I'm saying is to not just trust the health of our memory, which informs the way that this map is being created, right? And to actually, I think for most people, just almost acknowledge that that's likely to have some issues with it, and that I could play with that by just doing the exact opposite of what this thing is telling me and see what happens from there and start to collect that information, right, as a way to go about rebalancing or rectifying some of the way that my memory may have been, if I'm going to use the word unhealthy. Is this making sense? Like it's exactly the same thing as you're saying. I'm just kind of putting it into, I guess, into terms that make sense for me. Does that follow?
Yeah, I just want to add something in here from Feldenkrais, from Moshe Feldenkrais, because this is, I listen to you saying I need to recognize that that's the map talking to me, and I still feel like for some people it's just going to feel abstract or they're not going to get there. But he did this really incredible thing in his pedagogy, which was to, I mean, I don't think he's the only person who sees this, but he had a particular way of working with it. So there's what we call familiarity, and there's something else that's called comfort. And we think they're the same thing, but they're potentially not. Now, if my life is fairly comfortable, or I think it's more comfortable than how it might be if all hell breaks loose out there if I change something, right? So then I'm going to say, well, I want to keep returning to the familiar. That makes me feel comfortable. The idea that I have to actually get is it might be the case that there is greater comfort than I have ever known outside of what's familiar. And so what Feldenkrais would do, and he was working with movement, but I think he made it very clear that, I mean, he liked working with human movement, the body going through space, because it's very concrete. You actually can map it, and two people can agree pretty well, like, oh, he's raising his left arm in the air, you know, like he did it like this. He shifted his weight in that direction. But if we all were to stand around and raise our left arms into the air, and then we were to observe very, like do a nice observation, we'd realize, oh, they actually raised their left arm in 3 different ways. And maybe one of us says, you know, my arm hurts if I hold it up in the air too long. And then we would start asking other questions, like the example I gave, do you shift your weight? If you lift your arm up over your head and you shift your weight under your arm versus you shift your weight away from it, it's going to feel very different. One is going to feel easier to keep your arm up there versus the other. But I can do the same thing, in how I relate to another person. Oh, that's the person who voted for the candidate that I didn't vote for, so I will enact this pattern. And it's just a habit, right? So what Feldenkrais did is just notice what your habits are, like map your habits. He would have you raise your arm 10 times in a row and notice, did you do it while you're breathing in? Did you do it while you're breathing out? Did you shift towards the arm that was lifting or away? What were you doing with your eyes? What were you doing? And you really map it. And then whether it feels like a successful action or not, he'd say, okay, that's your habit. So now I want you to do it again. If you shifted to the left, I want you to shift to the right. If your eyes were open, I want you to close your eyes. If you did it while breathing in, I want you to do it while breathing out. So that you're actually comparing the habit to the non-habitual action, which always feels awkward when you first do it. But if you're the person who takes the weight out from under the arm every time you do it, and I've worked with clients like this, and you discover that bringing your weight under the arm, oh my gosh, it feels better. That's more support. That's more comfortable. You're shocked at something that's actually comfortable that you didn't know. And my first experience of doing the practice, I remember saying to people and saying to myself, I didn't know it was possible to feel this good. Because what he was having me do was try out with my body something that my body has never tried out before. And this is just maybe one little, I don't know, so Daniel, you were asking, is forgiveness something we do with the mind, or is it something we do with the body? The question would also be like, are the habits of the body or the habits of the mind more deeply grooved in? I mean, I don't know that we could necessarily say it's the case for everyone the same way, but I think that the thing about the body is it's pretty concrete. So if I see you shifting to the left, I can ask you to shift to the right. Now, if you tell me that you're filled with terror when you shift to the right, maybe we need to bring in Aspasia as well. But it's even so, the terror comes as I do the movement I've never done before, as opposed to, so I think.
And it's pre-verbal too, Seth, right? I think the pre-verbal component is important with the body.
Yeah. Well, just to take this one step further, I was talking to someone about this example the other day. I had a trainer, so another movement exercise, you're lying on the back and you lift, let's say, your right hip. And if you lift it enough, because the pelvis is connected to the spine, is connected to the head, your head might want to move. So if you lift your hip on one side, you might end up rolling your head over to the other direction. And so that would be an investigation you can make. What does my head do when I lift the hip? And so I lift my right hip and my head rolls to the left. But then the question would be, what is the tiniest movement of my right hip that I could make where my head would move the tiniest amount to the left. In other words, how tiny can I even think of raising my hip, and the whole pattern starts to happen. And then if I can get to that place, can you do the movement where you lift your hip and your head rolls the other way, but not because you decide to roll your head the other way? Can you actually find the pattern before the movement? Can you find the embryo of the pattern within you that would create a new movement, right? So it's like, yeah, it's really hard. I mean, but you can get to that place, and then maybe you fake it a bunch of times, but you start to feel something, and you start to build the whole body pattern of moving that hip, and the head rolls the opposite direction than what was originally my habit. But it has to be intentional, and I have to build it. Anyways, that gets into a very specific physical movement. But if we can translate.
But the parallel is almost exact, Seth, as you're talking about it, with what I do, right? It's crazy how similar it is. There are some differences, kind of we can go quite intense quite quickly, but for various reasons. But it's a similar thing. It's and it's a similar experience. And I know you haven't finished, so I'll be quiet in a sec. But the experience that's similar is once people break through their predetermined notion of how uncomfortable it's going to feel to do that, though, how uncomfortable it's going to feel to finally like experience these emotions and this impulse, that it's counterintuitive. They come to experience the exact opposite. I've never felt so calm. I've never felt so in control of my ability to take action. I've never felt so clear-minded about what I could do in this moment, what options are available to me, which one feels right. And it's the exact opposite of what everything inside them has told them it's going to be like. And that's the thing that keeps them trapped in the old system. But sorry, I cut you off there.
Well, I'll just add the last thing here, because I think the central question is what Daniel asked. It's facing the other.
Yeah.
So let's just assume that the last time we were together, or the last 5 times we were together, we had an argument. Well, if I assume that we're going to have an argument, I'm already in the bodily posture of preparing for an argument. And if I walk into the room, even thinking I don't want to have an argument, I really want to avoid it, but I'm still predicting because that's what seems to happen. And therefore, because it's, intelligent to be prepared, I'm sort of preparing for the argument. Well, your antenna is going to pick up that this guy's walking into the room preparing for an argument. You might also not want the argument, right? So I actually have to say, I'm going to imagine that we're actually about to have a really good connection, and we're about to leave our problems behind, or whatever. I have to imagine something that contradicts sort of the past, which is another place that I think we build the map, right? The map is built on past events. And we have to remember there is nothing that says the future will be a repetition of the past, but it certainly can be. I think, Daniel, I heard you say once that we don't remember what the past feels like. We only remember what happens. There's just got to be some way that we can reimagine a possibility that isn't a repetition of the past, even though it would be very rational to think that this is going to turn out the way it turned out the last 5 times.
But the bit that we definitely can have more say over is ourselves. And so sometimes too, I think it's even being able to imagine that we might be able to be with the beginnings of that argument or the conflict or whatever in some different way. At least we're introducing something new. So I agree, it is important to be able to imagine the whole thing. But even if one is skeptical about that, or that seems, what we can be kind of clearer on is, I can at least enter into this as an experiment of how can I be with this differently, and how much does that contribute to it changing as well. Yes.
The word experiment is a very good word. We actually have to be more willing to conduct experiments within our daily behaviors.
Definitely.
Otherwise, we will We will just reproduce what we tend to reproduce. I don't know how I am going to grow and transform into a different version of myself that functions better just by chance. I'm gonna have to, from time to time, ask myself to do the thing that I wouldn't otherwise do.
Yes.
How do we even do something difficult? I think that is the question. And if we cannot answer this question, we are doomed.
And why?
In our personal lives, in our personal lives, geopolitically, et cetera, so forth. Do let me know if the internet's messing up. I apologize. But how do we even do something difficult? Yeah. Life is at the mercy of patterns. If we don't identify our patterns, then that's our life. And so what's very interesting on what you're describing, Seth, on this idea of you have to find patterns in the body to make a new movement. And then there's also the idea that you make a new movement to find the patterns in the body, right? Like I do often feel it's interesting to think of the order there. It sometimes feel like and I think you were pointing to this, is the new movement makes you realize you were in a pattern, right? Before then, it wasn't a pattern. It was just the way of things. First off, I wonder if basically practices like that in the body are building up physically the health to be able to do it in the mind, right? Also, basically for me, what you were just saying there is analogous to the idea of the only way to find bodies in the mind is to encounter the other, because that is a new movement. Like if I ask you to find new ideas without encountering otherness, then those new ideas will just be in service of the internal consistency of the map you already have, right? So the only way to actually find the patterns that you are intellectually, ideologically, emotionally, whatever in, is actually in the encounter of the other person, who must be different. That is going to open up the new movement. Well, then you have to be able to do something difficult, because encountering otherness is difficult, and it would be easier just to stay in your room or whatever, right? There's a kind of game theory problem here, where if you do what is rational, you never do that which you need to find new movement. And if you never find the new movement, you can never identify the patterns you are in. And if those patterns are actually leading to repetitions that are self-effacing, you're done, right? So I think also more and more, I've just been thinking about how we've completely misunderstood what religion did. Religion was not primarily about making you feel okay about dying and going to heaven. It was dealing with game theory problems. Like, you must forgive, you must face your enemy, you must love your neighbor. It turns out if a society doesn't do that, it ends up in rational impasses. If it doesn't have abstractions like, hey, like you were talking about voices, the voices inside. If you just do the first voice, you might just do the internal consistency. So that's like spiritual warfare. Oh, there's a voice in you. Oh, it's the tempting. Like, as a little practice, generally you need to have a conversation of voices within you that bring you to the place where you realize that we are human beings trying to deal with life, and life is hard. Like, very rarely do we have a inner voice that leads us to the place of seeing the other person is trying to figure out this crazy life as well. You're the victim. No one understands what you've been through and the hardship you've had, and these people don't appreciate you, and they'll never get it. And if they only knew, that's the voice, right? Well, that would be, in terms of spiritual warfare, a demonic voice, right? And you need to be able to meet it with, say, Holy Spirit, which is the voice that goes, that's the one that's coming so fast and quick and sure of it. This is where philosophy can be useful. So, for example, we're supposed to know that certainty is impossible. The demonic voice is certain. Oh, that's a characteristic. It's demonic. It's also really fast. Oh, interesting. Speed tends to be lack of control, tends to be polverilio. It can be problematic. Like, you can actually use some of the things you've learned to kind of identify problematic inner voices, right? And the importance of actually having that conversation to actually bring it to a place. If the voice within you is not helping you come to a place where we are all just human beings trying to deal with life, and life is hard, it is very likely demonic. And that has to be taken very seriously. I think another part of this equation that has to be thought is the willingness to face someone does not necessarily mean you interact with them constantly. Because I'm going to the extreme example of the Jew and the Nazi, because that is the key example of the sunflower and the forgiveness question. The willingness of the victim of the Nazi to face the Nazi is not the same as saying the Jew must therefore invite the Nazi into their home or things like that, right? Actually, there's a certain sort of mystery. It's like all we can ask is the willingness to face, and then we don't know what happens. Like, who knows what occurs? And to me, I've also been thinking about that radical encounter, which I won't claim that I have the ability. If someone did something horrible to my family, I don't want to act like I would have the ability to do that. But I am pointing at it as some sort of perhaps ideal that seems necessary for the problem of global pluralism, if global pluralism has any chance of not destroying itself, which maybe it doesn't. But I am more and more looking at that as almost, I want to say, a social mysticism. And I think the word mysticism has become this, you go out of society and you have a psychedelic vision or whatever. But I'm thinking of that word in the sense of this unfolding of we don't know what. Like this kind of radical encounter is when things can happen between people if they're willing to actually do it, that you can only refer to as mystical. Now, what does that look like? I'm not sure. Maybe it looks like the individual who faces the one who murdered their children doesn't mean they necessarily interact with them, but they become a kind of subject who is very, very different in their being, right? Like it does something to them. Seth, please, you're muted. You're muted, Seth. There you go, Seth.
Yeah, sorry. No, I just wanted to briefly say there was actually a news story a couple, 2-3 years ago. The mother of a murdered child went in the courtroom and embraced the murderer of her child. And the thing about it, though, is to this point you're making about social mysticism, and like you said, you don't go take a psychedelic, but I read an article and it was like a psychedelic moment for everyone in the courtroom, because it's like, wait a minute, that's the mother of the victim. What's she doing? And yet I think she was a religious person, and she just was very clear. I'm not going to bring more hate. And she actually made this maneuver, and people couldn't believe it. But and I want to give back to you because you were going somewhere with that. But just to say that I'll even maybe search and see if I can find the article afterwards. But yeah, that's a powerful break in the pattern that I think it speaks right to what you were saying about what religion might really be for.
Yeah. And, I think there's some sort of social mysticism in there. But then, of course, I think of Ivan Karamazov hearing about the Russians killing all of the children and telling God, I'll turn my ticket back in. If this is the kind of way that social mysticism works, I want nothing to do with it, right? And that almost seems to be the proper response, right? Because there's a certain sort of, God would make a world where people need to be able to do that kind of thing. Isn't that just too terrible? And yet, isn't it interesting because it also seems to be the height of beauty to actually be able to do it at the same time in this, but that high, I want to say, geometry of the most horrible and the most beautiful all being wrapped together in this experience that we talked about it before, that transcends the knowledge of good and evil. Like I'm more and more been speaking about how the act of forgiveness is basically the turning back the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Where basically the knowledge, because it's very interesting, why in the garden is it the knowledge of good and evil versus the knowledge of evil, right? Because I think it's the knowledge of the interplay between good and evil. Adam and Eve actually had the knowledge of good before the tree. It's being with God. They knew what good was, right? They also actually did know what evil was. Don't eat from that tree. So they actually knew it, right? So what is going on here? For me, I just more and more wonder about the dynamic between the knowledge of good and evil, right? Because that's victimhood. They hurt me, they're evil, I won't talk with them. Unforgiveness, anger is not so much rage, often tied to, it's not merely they're evil, I'm good. If I'm evil and they're evil, you don't have anger. It's a dynamic between good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil that's going on, right? There's something about these moments of social mysticism that is a kind of turning in of the knowledge of good and evil, right? That's a kind of an event, almost in a Bedouin sense. Like it's a kind of event in that courtroom that suspends all categories. And it says, you must decide how you will respond to this. You must decide what this means. And that kind of smack in the face, because mystical experiences are like that, are they not? They say, you must decide now. Now that you've had this mystical experience, what will you do? Was it just a psychedelic illusion? Was it God? Was it in your head? You've had it. Now you must choose. There is something about these moments of social mysticism that have a certain sort of pinning down in the Sardian sense, a sort of like, you must decide. Basically, the suggestion I would also say, if this kind of social mystical, and I'm just using that phrase here, but these experiences of turning back the knowledge of good and evil, if these are actually ultimately at the key moments where we are made or broken, like where everything hinges, right? Then it becomes incredibly important that we have the training in the body, in our emotions, and our mind to be able to handle these things, to just hold it, right? Can you, because in the same way that Aspasia, because I imagine this soul school, because what is the first thing people want to do, perhaps when they hear about someone forgiving the murderer? Most people, you can imagine people getting angry, actually. You can imagine people getting mad and saying, you shouldn't do that, right? Can we hold the emotion? Can we just have it pass through us? Maybe that is, if you can do that in the network, the social network, that begins having a transformation on people that could also make them perhaps clearer and more discerning. And better decision makers and better people of approaching. These are all live thoughts. So I am thinking of this. I will pause there and I will pass it.
There's also something of a, I don't know if leadership's the right word, but there is almost kind of like a leadership quality to that say the parent of the child who was murdered chooses to forgive, and the people of the community around them might be convinced that they shouldn't forgive and all this. But, like if that person does, the person that you could say has been most affected, there's kind of this leadership quality. I often too, I'm not sure exactly how it fits in, but it does. I can't find the words yet, but I often, when we talk about this sort of thing, think about, if it was me, if I was the child that was murdered, and I think about, my surviving parents, I would want for them more than anything to forgive. I would want their freedom from having to bear the agony of holding on to the pain and the anger and that they would feel. I wouldn't want their life to become this crusade against this person, right? And I think about, the same thing with my kids. I would want my kids to feel that freedom too if something were to happen to me. And there's something in that speaks to, I guess that speaks to the direction of what we do on the other side of that. And I do want to stress too, like you, Daniel, I don't mean to imply that I believe that I would be capable of that if someone were to do that to my children or my family. But, there is something here about holding complexity of emotion inside, noting that in doing that, we are actually resonating with this shared humanity. We all encounter that complexity inside. We all wrestle with it. We are all capable of doing extraordinarily terrible things, and have all had extraordinarily terrible things done to us. And there's something of the gestalt in all of this as well. Just I think in that act of forgiveness, it's kind of almost the recognition that we're all kind of one and the same. And there is a decision point, I guess, in that moment, in the feeling of everything towards the person who has done something so damaging and so horrific to us. Of how is this going to shape all of us from here? I can't put it into words yet.
Yeah, it's a facing towards the future rather than a facing towards the past.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, because I'm like, okay, if I said this on the video now. So this woman's name is Mary Johnson Roy. And I mean, maybe we'll put a link with the video, but she talks about, there's actually a conversation she did with the man. on National Public Radio. They came together. And she says, I just hugged the man that murdered my son, and I instantly knew that all that anger and the animosity, all the stuff I had in my heart for 12 years for you, she's speaking to him directly, I knew it was over, that I had totally forgiven you. And then she says, I treat you as I would treat my son. And, you know, I mean, there's a whole conversation here, but this really occurred, you know, and it's real, it's possible. And I think, you know, to what you both said about would I be capable, I don't think any of us know, but I think maybe even what we're saying here is, are we capable of imagining that we'd be capable? Because there's a way that from a certain point of view, what do you do with someone who hurts your family? You hurt them back. That's just, you know, that's just what you do. And so you have to actually suspend that very rational seeming response. And I think also what you were saying, Aspasia, the only way that it becomes rational again is that, you know, my sphere of love basically is larger than my family, right? It's like, I mean, there's something very logical about, you know, self-preservation and then, you know, expanding that to my immediate kin. But it really is, you know, other people have talked about, well, what we need is an alien invasion, or they talk about how people come together when there's a natural disaster, right? But some massive external, you know, problem that unites us. However, I think the problem is internal to humanity. I don't think it is external. So that's maybe the flip. But, you know, I find myself curious. If more people aren't having these same thoughts, you know, that you know, if you look at politics in the United States right now, I mean, you could look at politics in many parts of the world. I do hear people who are partisan, who are nonetheless kind of revolted at the overall scene, right? So they know which side of the aisle they're on, but they're also looking at the state of the overall discourse, right? And they're saying, you know, or they're saying, you know, they're frustrated and they're mad at the other, but they name this thing that, well, but that other person is just looking at what they see on their social media feed, and how would they know any better? There's still a little bit of maybe contempt or derision that I hear in the voice sometimes, but there's also an acknowledgement that the other person is working with what they have to work with, and that what the other is working with is different than what I'm working with. So that's all very, I think, common sense to a lot of people at this point. So what do you do when you're speaking to another person and you just are pretty sure that half the words you're using are defined differently by them? Well, you're going to have to, at a certain point, say, let's make a new dictionary together, you know, so that we can talk. I mean, I think I feel like what we're doing here is just breaking down the little steps. And I think each of these individual steps isn't so scary, right? And that's also necessary from the point of view of the overall terror of the large step is to break it into smaller steps. So just start by putting on your shoes. Like, you're not confronting the other yet. First, you have to get dressed and get in your car and drive across town and meet them. And then when you're face to face, that'll be really scary. But you know what? You're not even there yet. Just put your shoes on.
Yeah. No, I love the way that you do bring the focus back to putting things into practical, concrete terms and breaking it down into the steps. At the risk of expanding out again, just briefly, but I do think it links. I was thinking too, as both of you were speaking there too, about you know, I think there is also an argument that can be made that it's socially adaptive to forgive and actually reach out to the person who I guess the person who does wrong, to reach out to them and actually care. Like, the vision is really to reach out. The story you're telling, Seth, of reaching out and hugging the person who had killed her son, to give that person, right, the thing that they probably never received, which is probably part and parcel of how they found themselves in a situation where they did act on the impulse to lash out and kill someone's son, right? If we put it in those terms, the kind of the healing relational repair that requires care and love, it requires us to be able to connect with what I'm calling this shared humanity, this loving, positive feeling towards our fellow human being, who, in recognizing what they did, we can recognize probably what they must have experienced in their life. As well, and having some compassion towards that, and that actually for a community to reach out. I'm going to put psychopaths on the side because that's the problem here, is that they're a different category, and I actually think that's where a lot of the problem in politics comes from, right? Is the psychopathic personality. But if we put that to one side, and not everyone who does it, most people that commit these sorts of crimes aren't psychopathic, right? Necessarily. That we could reach out and actually care for people, and bring them in and love them and care for them and try to give them some sort of nurturance that they have not had in their life, to try and heal the relational injuries, right, that have made it more probable that they would act in this way. You could talk about that as actually being socially adaptive. As opposed to putting someone in a prison and isolating, or like sending them away, which I can understand the argument for that as well, right? But this idea of moving towards a position where we are able, again, it comes back to the complexity of feeling, to both notice exactly what we are feeling in relation to what they have done to us, the anger, and also hold with it. In the realization that really deep down we are all capable of very awful things, and had we experienced maybe, I don't know, the childhood they had, or the impossible decision point that they were in at that moment that led them to act in the way that they did, which took our child, or that we may have been capable of actually doing the same thing they did, that from that we might get more of that feel of the compassionate, loving feelings. It's not to cancel out the anger, and I think that's the importance. We don't do it as a strategy so that we don't feel the anger, but we can just hold them both together. And I think because we need to be able to have the signal of anger, it lets us know it's not okay. It's both not okay, and that loving impulse almost, as a yearning to try to take responsibility myself to do something about that might assist here, and again, it's future thinking, I guess. It's about how can I recognize that whatever's happening for this person, I might have some responsibility and ability to care for them in a way that might reduce the likelihood of them doing that again in the future, if we put it in those terms. So that's kind of expanding back out again. But I do think it's related to the practical points there, Seth. Sorry to take it wide again.
Not at all. I think what you're saying on adaptability, so theoretically, that which is infinitely adaptable should never be destroyed, kind of in cybernetic talk. If it is infinitely adaptable, then under no possible circumstance in any possible world would it be destroyed, right? And basically, if you can forgive in the worst of all possible circumstances, then that would suggest that at least socially you are infinitely adaptable and therefore anti-fragile, right? But of course, Ivan Karamazov might say, if you're infinitely adaptable to these Russian generals killing children before the Grand Inquisitor section, then that's a system I don't want anything to deal with, right? I'll turn in my ticket. But that might be getting at why I think actually the choice of one's relation to the question of forgiveness is the absolute choice at the basis of religion. Religion has been overly indexed as the question of belief in God and what kind of God. In terms of the social, I think it has way more to do with questions of like forgiveness, ultimately. Mm-hmm. And basically, without religion, we are notably lost on this. Not that we were necessarily clear on it. You could argue Jesus gives you a model, and I just use Christianity because that's what I am. Jesus gives you a model of what to do if they come for you, lay down your life and die on the cross. But we did not see Jesus having to respond to Peter being killed. We did not have Jesus show us the model of one of his disciples being killed, right? We have the model of Jesus laying down his life. And I think that sometimes perhaps, well, the model, well, the model is the martyrs, the social martyrs, right? They put down themselves in pacifism and dying together, like is being, but this opens up much. If we cannot forget, and again, I just keep going back to this point. If global pluralism cannot think this, it's doomed. It is doomed. It is over because the system has a breakpoint that is not adaptable, right? And so, and also, just stress this point as well. There's the conversation, and I think we've talked about it: centralization, decentralization. So everyone's talking decentralization now, right? That's how we're going to solve centralization. Well, let's say decentralization will give you belonging and it will give you meaning. But without the problem of forgiveness, what ends up happening when you're decentralized, you isolate, okay? And when you isolate, you stop training the muscle of dealing with difference. And one day you encounter difference. And because that muscle has atrophied, it goes terribly. And that's when war begins again. And then it swings back to centralization. And then that swings to decentralization over and over again. There are many people now. You see this white nationalist movement, you see these fascist communities forming, and people are talking about how they feel at home, they feel belonging, they feel social intelligibility. Yes, they do. That's actually the problem. Like, if we don't deal with this question of global pluralism, people are going to get their meaning. They're going to freaking get their belonging, but they're going to get it in an environment that atrophies their capacity to handle otherness. And one day, that other is going to be encountered, especially if you still use technology. Because you have the internet. Oh, and guess what? Natural resources are not evenly distributed. So you're going to have to interact with other countries who are different from you to get the lithium for your computer. There we go. So, and I know we've mentioned this before, but the stakes are high. I think what you were mentioning on leadership is exactly right. Because once you've seen that somebody is, because leadership can also be thought of, I actually kind of like a way I sometimes think about leadership is the introduction of a now undeniable possibility. Once someone whose child has been killed hugs them, you know it's possible in this world for it to occur. And now you have to decide. That means something about your life. Can you do it? Can you not? Is it genetic? Is it social? Is it religious? You have to ask the question because now it has been introduced to you as a possibility. I think a leader in a deep sense introduces a possibility that in doing it is now undeniable that it can be done. So what will you do then? What will the world do? How will we think this? I think there's a lot. Also, basically, there was an idea that was being talked about on people just basically being stuck in patterns. Like if they can't adapt, there are patterns that you are stuck in. Like adaptability and the ability to leave patterns are tied together, right? Because one of the reasons you can say, I guess this is just the point I was going to make, and then I'll say a few more things and then pass it. The opposite, patterns are kind of the opposite of adaptability. Because when you can't adapt, you find a pattern. And you don't have to adapt. You just do the pattern. But the problem is that the pattern eventually leads to self-effacement, but you can't adapt to leaving that self-effacement, so you're self-effaced, or you auto-cannibalism, so you're destroyed, right? But adaptability is also not a deconstruction of a pattern. It's a redirecting of a pre-existing pattern into a new movement, right? That's why it's critical to say the map is indestructible. The name of the game is not to destroy maps, but to change our relationship to them in a manner that makes us comfortable with what I call the girdle point, which for our purposes here is basically handling otherness. If you try to deconstruct maps, as postmodernism did, it doesn't work. Like we're ending the age of trying to get rid of maps, get rid of ideologies, and see if that works. Because it doesn't. People go mad. I think also you were pointing out how there are many people today who have a sense that the conversation, partisanship, it's all going wrong, we can't meet on the other side, et cetera, so forth. Well, the problem is Basically, in order for people to overcome that Nash equilibria, that rational impasse, you have to do that of which feels ethically immoral. You have to talk with the people who's voting for Trump, and Trump is a fascist or something. How could you talk with these people who are okay with a president doing what he's doing with ICE? You're a monster. We all individually will say partisanship is bad. But you see, collectively, if I start interacting with the other side, I'm seen differently by the people on my team. That's the problem. It has social ramifications for me. I did a presentation at Philosophy Portal with Cadell at the Rosie conference too, talking about the issue of appearing heretical. And basically, the only way you overcome rational impasses is that there have to be people that are willing to appear as heretics, not actually be heretics, like appear as a heretic, right? So if you talk with the Trumpian or talk with the liberal or Trump, you appear as a heretic to your ideology, right? But then, of course, the key is you can show, well, actually, in liberalism, we believe in freedom of speech, and so we believe that conservatives should be able to voice their views, and I'm not agreeing with them, I'm just supporting freedom of speech because that's in the tenet of progressivism, you could say, going back for many, many years. You can make that argument. Some people may go against it, but what are you trying to do in that move? You're trying to say the act of reaching for the other makes me appear heretical, but actually it's consistent with my beliefs, right? It's consistent with my worldview. So you're trying to show that people's worldviews, oh, here's the key. If you do that and you show it's consistent with your worldview, then all those other people who share those worldviews, who don't like what you just did, you've unveiled to them that in their very worldview is the possibility of doing that thing. That's why the strategy of appearing heretical is so powerful. But boy, howdy, is it nervous system emotionally difficult. It is insanely difficult. But that's very similar to the person in the courtroom with secular mysticism that is showing an undeniable possibility. Appearing heretical is showing now an undeniable possibility, which people have to be willing to do, or the system will not have adaptability within it. And therefore, it will be in massive trouble. So the system has to have people doing these kind of things, or it ends up in rational impasses. And but you see, because ultimately all of this will always come down to the ethical real, which is that phrase I like to use combining Lacan, the real. The real is always ethical. And people like the great Alenka Zupanto, she points to, it's an ethical real. Like, we've done a big, in Belonging Again, part one, we've done a big mistake in overthinking the other as someone who has different views from you. The other is someone who has different ethics from you. That is what's hard. It's one thing to say that they like computer science while I like literature. It's another thing to say what I think is unethical, they don't think is unethical. I think they wronged me and they don't think they did. The ethical real is the true shocker, the true surprise that breaks everything apart, that causes civil wars, that causes revolution. The revolution is always ethical, for good or for bad. And most of the time bad, because we're not able to handle ethical difficulties, because you'd have to have real control over your nervous system and anger. Because where does anger come from? Anger and ethics go together strongly. We don't tend to get angry over people choosing a Sprite when we like Pepsi. We get angry when they do that which we think is unethical. So we can talk about pluralism and diversity all day long, but if we can't handle ethical differences, we're screwed. But Daniel, are you saying that you should be okay with literally people doing something unethical? And so the mother hugs the person in the courtroom. So the person faces and gives back the knowledge of the fruit of good and evil, right? What are the limits of this? What are not the limits of this? These are incredibly, incredibly dire questions. And basically, the suggestion, there is more to say because we can get into that, but there's more to say, but I'll stop. Basically, the suggestion that I am putting forth, that we have discussed and that y'all have agreed with, is that if this is not thought, if this is not figured out, everything fails. Everything fails because it trickles back to the anger problem, which cannot be controlled. And anything that has been built, anything that has been put forth is doomed. And in fact, not only is it doomed, because of the greatness of what has been built, it could be worse in its inverse because of its grandeur. Because all great things, when they fail fundamentally, are worse than non-great things that fail fundamentally. The stakes are very, very high. And I just keep coming back to this Incredibly important question. I will pause.
Mm. I keep coming back to this image of, which we've probably talked about before, um, of just how important the distinction between the unconscious and conscious forces are, and just this idea of like the magma that's always swirling underneath, that it's looking for opportunities to bubble up and to sort of invite us to pay attention to it and to bring it into consciousness and to come through the mantle. I don't know if I'm using the right words. And that, you know, all these words that we use, anxiety, surprise, being, waiting for that, anticipating that that will happen, and that it's, and that that's needed, as opposed to seeing those as very scary, like, you know, need to just keep everything certain. And I think this speaks to what you're talking about with the sort of isolating into groups, Daniel, and this sort of the patterns crystallize, and there's this crust of certainty, that just, and it's enforced kind of in this group context, right? That if one person even starts to be curious as to the magma underneath, then, you know, there's a very strong, yeah, there's a way that the resistance ensures that doesn't take place, and everyone falls in line. And like you say, the more that this crust is built upon, the more the stakes rise, about ensuring that it remains that way. And how can we try to bring some of this, I guess, conceptualization of unconscious, conscious, just the idea, I guess, that we're not, well, this is how I see it, we're not privy to all of it, but like that we can only contain and know so much in any one moment. And I mean, for me, life is about the adventure of knowing that's always going to have twists and turns, and there are always going to be things that are bubbling up that surprise me. It can be highly inconvenient, as well. Like, I'm not saying it's all wonderful, and some of those I am trying to just push back down because I don't have time right now. But not seeing it as something that is wrong with the system, I guess, or something that's wrong. That this is actually the whole purpose of things, and that, I guess what I'm trying to say is that that will also be updating and changing the map. And I don't know how to, yeah, like how to bring that idea into more easier kind of everyday parlance, and sort of integrate it into some of these like sort of more concrete skills that we're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, that seems to be a really tricky point for some people to want to take on. They don't like the idea, I think, that there are even unconscious forces. I think that whole terminology, unconscious forces, is probably not the right way to be approaching it anyway. There's probably a better way to speak about it. But I'm really curious, in amongst all of this, how we bring language, and build that aspect into some of these skills as well. That the things that are going on outside of our conscious awareness in this moment are not necessarily scary, but we have been primed to treat them like they're scary, and there's an incredible vitality and growth and health that comes from seeing them as invitations to, I guess, understand a different aspect of the gestalt in that moment. Like, it's kind of like this, you know, and I know that that's going to shift again, and I'm just seeing one kind of part of things from a particular viewpoint, and that bit I'm really interested in bringing into this picture as well, because once that's on board, I think it is somewhat easier to talk about the how we deal with differences, because again, it comes back to that idea that, well, I've seen 1,000 different versions of me, right, and 1,000 different versions of my perspective and ability to make sense of something in a moment over my lifetime. I'm open to that. I know there'll be differences again, time and time again, that it's not so foreign to me to see someone else's in a completely different spot to where I am, and how they're taking in the information and making sense of it. So again, for me, it sort of always comes back to, well, if I can get better attuned to how that operates within me, that is the thing that then helps me in relationship. But you can do it the other way too. I think noticing it in relationship can be the thing that helps you understand that it happens within you too. So I throw that out there because Seth, you're also great at actually narrowing this down to like kind of concrete, practical stuff for people who are listening, whereas I'm kind of up here floating around. I'm always kind of curious about how we bring that into some of this as well. And I know how to do it, you know, in a very structured, like, you know, some very one-on-one therapy way. But when we're talking about this more general kind of talking of skills and ideas for people, I'm curious where your mind goes with that, Seth.
Well, actually, in my work, something that I've been doing over the last few years is, I was describing earlier a Feldenkrais lesson where someone's lying on the floor, but life doesn't happen lying on the floor. So it's good to have these kinds of set aside practices. But the thing we talked about before, the daily ground, was something where most of the invitations were something that you can do within the flow of your day. And I mean, the basic thing we're talking about here is difference. And so maybe the first question is, can I tolerate difference? You know, later, can I become curious about difference? You know, maybe the most difficult, like the samurai level, is, can I embrace difference? But, you know, I mean, there's a million ways, and there's books and books and books written about how to form new habits and things like that. But it really can be something small. But the thing is, if I do something small and I succeed at taking on that small amount of difference, I have to be willing to say, well, what's the next step after that? And it's funny, you were saying that I narrow things down, but one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of zooming out is also a time scale. Because I think a lot of the non-rational moves that prove to be a good move, you need a few years to go by and look back, and then you say, thank God, like the Cuban Missile Crisis example that Daniel likes to use. And you know, I mean, we could even imagine that we're in a place with all this talk of apocalyptic scenarios with AI where people might actually wonder, you know, what would be a good pattern for me to enact for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years, rather than, you know, over the course of, you know, the next week or whatever. I do think that yeah, I think so now I'm speaking more generally, but I think a general principle here that is really important is we need to even try to stretch our habits of perception. We need to, how do these patterns show up? We recognize patterns, but how do we recognize patterns? Because we're looking in a particular direction. Maybe we need to look for patterns we haven't looked for before. Maybe we need to widen our gaze, or I don't know, travel to another country and see what it's like there. Those kinds of things. I keep coming back in my mind while we're talking to this idea of, I think it's authentic resonance, but that's just because I'm within my enclosed the faux authentic, right? But I think that is actually a very real problem. You know, Daniel mentioned the white nationalist group where everyone feels a sense of belonging. And I mean, actually, I think part of what we have to say is, wow, they never felt belonging before. You know, you actually have to have some empathy for that. Like, wow, what made you want to join that community? How bad was it before you had that white nationalist community there, where now you feel so? In other words, we really have to stretch our imagination in a particular way. I was wondering to myself, though, if there is some principle of authentic resonance that points through this, because, you know, if I feel a sense of belonging, if I feel resonance within my enclosed community, is there still some signal that lets me know it's kind of ringing a little hollow, like all the notes are playing in tune? And again, until I see something better, maybe I don't know that. But, you know, if we take the example of this woman hugging the murderer of her son, I don't think we could ever know the answer, but I try to imagine what did it feel like inside of her own heart. Like, I can only imagine that she feels this incredible expansion. And she talks about for 12 years, you know, she had this hatred. I was just reading a book also of a man telling the story of people murdered his brother. And, you know, he had all these health problems forever. And I don't know that he necessarily went to the others and forgave them, but he had to let go of it, right? He had to let go of the idea. Sometimes it's not a person that I can get back to, it's the world that wronged me. How can the world do this to me, right? And so anyway, my question is, another phrase that came to mind is something like authentic dissonance. Like the moment where, as Daniel says, he thinks that he didn't do an ethical wrong and I think he did. That might be an authentic dissonance. But can I actually see that that's happening? Even though I think he just did something wrong, can I see the fact that he doesn't see it that way as something other than just like, as you referred to, that therefore he's a psychopath? Because yes, there are psychopaths, but you know, if every single experience the other ever had in their life led them to do the thing that makes total sense, that to me is an atrocity, it doesn't mean I have to suddenly stop thinking it was atrocious, but somehow I have to understand that if I were them, I would have done what they just did. Like and it's, I don't know how to explain that aside from, we just have to stretch our view. We have to be able to see, like if I'm looking at my hand right now, I just have to know that I can see this and I cannot see this. I can see this, but I have to know that this is your view, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, the way I think about it is that this is why I talk about authentic resonance from my point of view as being separate to emotions. Like they're different. So for me, the thing that helps to ensure that we are in touch with authentic resonance as opposed to a faux sense of certainty or authentic dissonance, authentic resonance, is that we've not just sat and thought through something at great depth, which I think we get trained to do. We have made a valid effort to feel all the feelings related to what has happened or related to what is happening within us as well. And that we purposely try to make them big in our body and notice the extent of them. And again, don't just accept anxiety as the feeling and go, or just accept actually a complete sense of calm inside, which I think is the thing that might get mistaken for authentic resonance, because our defenses, our cognitive defenses are operating so well, they contain all the anxiety. They are defenses against anxiety about feelings, right? So some people are just so well defended, they are calm and cool. There is no anxiety. Some people, the defenses are already breaking down, they're feeling anxious. But underneath both of those things are the feelings. And so once we can, this is what I think, once we can feel more sure that we've really done the work of feeling too, having the emotions related to it without needing to do anything with our actions. People get that confused. Just noticing it all, noticing the impulses that come with it. Then my experience working one-on-one with people is that then that clarity, that channel, that connection to noticing whatever this phenomenology of, yeah, that feels like the right thing to do for me. That feels right in this moment. That's just way more obvious, and there is a different felt sense of that that is different to what would feel like something that is defenses operating, which is kind of more like a calmness, maybe a certainty because of the calmness. Does that make sense? That's how I think about it. But that's a very particular way of putting it, and so I don't know how helpful that is. But please, Daniel, jump in.
I think that's very helpful because it is a mistake to conflate feeling better with authentic resonance, because you can feel better once you tell that person you're angry with to go to heck, right? I feel great now that I've told him that, or I feel great now that I've stopped talking to that prick. Oh, great, authentic resonance, I'm at home. So, and I think that actually It is one of the reasons why the ethical real is so difficult is because it feels great not to face it, actually. And actually, to reassert the dominance of your ethics can bring you a certain freedom, which is very problematic. I think um, the reliability of one's authentic resonance is proportion to their willingness to encounter otherness, especially in terms of ethical real, which is the top of otherness. And so openness, to the degree that one is open, is to the degree their authentic resonance is reliable. Because I would also point at the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit in Hegel, he talked about the problem of intuition, where people are starting to trust their intuition without going through the philosophical challenge and like conceptually mediating it. And he does that through the process of consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, then reason encounters spirit, spirit, religion, absolute knowing. And basically, authentic resonance is reliable to the degree that you work to absolute knowing. And absolute knowing is ultimately acceptance of the lack in the other, there is no lack in the other that is most difficult to accept than the ethical difference. You can accept the fact that there is no God, there's no transcendent guarantee, but it's very interesting. We may say all day that we don't believe in certainty, but when somebody wrongs us, we're very certain. We may say all day that there are no meta laws, no absolutes, but when we're mad at something, absolutes come back. In a very odd way, you don't finish the unleashing of the Holy Spirit through the death of Christ until you actually give back the knowledge of good and evil. You forgive because you actually still have certainty. God is not dead, actually. You know these people are monsters, so there's an absolute, right? I'd have to expand on that, but authentic resonance, for me, its reliability is proportioned to the degree one has made what Cadell talks about as the phenomenological journey. And it ultimately has to land in absolute knowing, which is an acceptance of the lack in the other, which we can say we know people are not perfect. We can say we know that we all make mistakes, but that ultimately just feeds our internal consistency. If when we encounter someone who wrongs us, we're not able to face them. I think also I would note as just a general claim, it would seem to me that we must increase the amount of social mysticism in the system to a critical mass, where basically the globe, in terms of global pluralism, will be destroyed by some Nash equilibria. Social mysticism increases the probability that a rational impasse is avoided. To the degree that it is present in the system, and because it is the ultimate, because the reason why I say that is because social mysticism basically seems to be the ultimate non-rational example. It's so non-rational that it is mystical in its intelligibility, but not from the mysticism of being pulled out, which is kind of transcendent of rationality. No, it is the mysticism found in the realm of rationality. It doesn't feel transcendent. It's in the middle of it. It appears at the girdle point of the social, internally consistent system. That is the most intense form. And for a cybernetic system, for a system of relations to be infinitely adaptive under all possible circumstances, it must have a critical mass of a supplier of the most difficult form of non-rationality to a critical mass in the system. If this is not present, then it is very unlikely that you will adapt. And also it is very unlikely that people will have the skills of non-rationality at lower levels in kind of trickle down almost, right? Because what it would take to make a society, a world, where there'd be a critical mass of social mysticism would require there to probably be the resources in place to increase the probability that the average person is more capable of non-rational activity, which would require what we have discussed. I would also note that many people will speak of the hard problem of consciousness. I certainly think that the hard problem is actually the hard problem of the ethical real. That is the hard problem. And in some respects, I think that the hard problem of consciousness can sometimes function as a certain imaginary focus to help us avoid facing the other if we're not careful. Although I don't deny that consciousness is a hard problem and difficult to think, but I think the ethical real is perhaps harder because it requires something of you. And that changes things. As a practice, perhaps just to kind of throw something, because there's more to say, but I do sometimes wonder if one can simply start, if somebody has wronged you, don't ask questions about forgiveness. Don't ask, just go face them. Just go face them. Not to tell them off, but to go face them and listen. Just do that. Because I will also wager, I would also say this to people. If you say, well, I'm not going to face them because I don't want to think about it. No. The only way to get them out of your head is to face them. You are not going to get, like, they will live in you. Like, you can't, like, why do people get so angry? It's because they can't stop getting out of the place. It's the exact opposite of what you think. You think not facing them will help you forget. It's the exact opposite. They will have permanent residency if you do not face them. So go and face them. Go face them until they're not in your head all the time. Which will happen when you humanize them, which maybe you still go, I'm not going to actually interact with them because they have some pathologies that are dangerous. But let me also, I think the goal can be thought of as this. Because I think when people hear this topic of forgiving and facing, they might go, are you telling me to keep relating to them because they're dangerous? And there are examples of dangerous people. That's why this is so hard, right? It seems incredibly difficult for people to stop interacting with somebody and not hate them. If it's a professional break where you say, I'm going to move to St. Louis and I'm not going to see you as much, so it's just like, cool. It's okay, right? It's not a question of can you stop interacting with someone and not hate them? Or start talking about, well, actually, I'm not because they're a bad person. I couldn't trust them. You start coming up with reasons why you don't interact them. The test is if you can stop interacting and not create an entire narrative of how they're not a bad person. Because one of the reasons people do that is because they don't want to look at themselves as the kind of person who would choose to stop interacting with somebody. They want to make it where, I was always willing, but they're just a bad person, right?
Yes.
Like, or they can't be trusted or whatever, right? If that is the logic in your head, for this person you're no longer interacting with, you need to go face them. Naturally in life, there are people in high school who I still really like, who I haven't seen in years. Does that mean I don't forgive them or something? Or that I think they're bad people? No, it's the course of life. There is a natural course of life that will lead to less interaction or people going in different directions. And actually, that's 90% of people's interactions that they no longer do or something like that. They've just kind of changed. But there's no hatred or anything. It's just the course of things. So we do know it's possible to not interact with someone and it not be a matter of unforgiveness. It's just a matter of change, right? The challenge is making that be if you're in a truly difficult situation, a truly dangerous situation, you could even, the Nazi with the Jew perhaps, or someone who is truly psychotic, right? Your challenge, I think the challenge is then saying, okay, I need to be able not to interact with them. How do I go about doing this in a manner where it is not, I'm going to create some narrative where they're evil and I'm good, where I'm not going to give into that temptation, and I'm also not going to have them take residence in my head where I hate them all the time. How to have a clean break, a professional break, which very often people will claim that's what they're doing. It's just a clean break. We've agreed it's a mutual. No, they're constantly talking about how the other side, it's not mutual, it's not like that. If that's what's going on, I do think you need to face them until that stops. I think the only way to make that stop is actually the act of facing them. And don't ask if I forgive it. Don't ask if they wrong me. Don't ask, just go face them. Just go face them. But that's why I come back to y'all's work, because that ask of facing and listening requires so much work in the body, so much work in the nervous system. And it just seems to me that that's it. If we can't figure out the nervous system, if we can't figure out facing people, if we can't work, it's done. It's over. The system is doomed because there's not enough points in the cybernetic system to supply a critical mass of, social mysticism, non-rationality. Like, if people are not doing what y'all are talking about, there will not be in the system enough points to bring non-rationality in, and we are finished. I know that's extreme. I believe it.
Yeah, me too.
And I would like to see it change. So keep up with the good work, friends.
No,
Keep up with it.
I believe it too. And the facing, the just going and facing, it's the same thing. You are in your facing of the person, you are eliciting again the emotions. That is the point. You are in the facing of the person, building your tolerance and your awareness of everything that's going on inside you at the same time as you face. And I was thinking when we were talking about, I think you've both actually said this, but I was thinking when we were talking about, just concrete ways of trying to ensure that we are not getting siloed into these little islands of certainty and isolated into smaller groups, to purposefully interact with people who are different to you, like this purposeful choosing to live a life where you do purposely go out and interact with people who hold different views or are very different to you. Um, they're purposely putting yourself in those situations is really important. And I think actually there's a way in which through doing that you can hone your connection to authentic resonance as well. You can get clearer around the bit that's authentic resonance without it needing to be, like a reaction that pushes the other away, but you just get clearer about your authentic resonance versus all the other stuff that might come up that keeps you kind of at a distance from interacting with difference altogether, which would be more the defensive layer. But yeah, the facing and the pushing towards, to bring some of these strands together, I often think about too, just an example that probably most people can relate to. The word might not be husband in the sentence, it might be co-worker or boss or friend or mother or whoever. But I often think about the example of, say you're very busy in the morning and you and your spouse are getting ready to go about your day, and you won't see each other again till nighttime. And then, your husband says to you right as you leave the door, by the way, I need to talk to you about something tonight. Right, and just being left with that for the rest of your day. Now, again, that's going to depend on your relationship, but it might be your friend or your boss or your mother. What goes on for a person during that entire day, holding on to the knowledge that the spouse said, I need to talk to you about something tonight, how that's associated with a whole network of memories that we will have from relationships past, from interactions with that particular person past, from how we sit with uncertainty in relationship. For some people, they won't even think about it again. They're fine, right? It won't mean anything. For a lot of people, it will be a torturous, emotional, anxiety-ridden experience all day,
All day.
potentially, all day, going around and around, what on earth could this possibly be about? And then all sorts of ways of thinking about how they're going to write off this person or avoid the conversation, or what they're going to do, rehearsing how they're going to start to have the conversation with. There's a million and one ways this can go, right? Or the needing to pick up the phone and ring. I can't wait till tonight. You have to tell me what's going on. I'm so, so there's a million different pathways that could go, but I think it is a nice example of how all these things come together off noticing how relationships are the site of being able to learn so much about what goes on inside ourselves and to push the limits, I guess, of what we think it is that we can be aware of, we can tolerate without having to do anything externally. And how we can also, in that process, the reason I bring it up is because in that process, if we really sit with it in a particular way, we can also become aware of all the different memories that are starting to come up for us, right? It's a whole network that gets pulled up inside us. It's actually really insightful and can tell us a whole story about the emotions that are being activated in this moment, how they link to very particular meaning making across time from relationships past, to right down to normally the source of the initial injury that happened to us. That is relevant to this particular example of whatever it is that happens when your spouse or your boss or your mother says to you, later on today, I need to talk to you about something, and they leave you to wait. there's an invitation there. We can either see that as a horrible thing for this person to have done to me, and or something I can't tolerate, and that person should know they can't say that kind of thing to me because I get panic attacks and I can't deal with those things, or almost a complete dismissiveness of maybe an over forgetting that they even said that because we can't tolerate it. And then actually finding ourselves making plans that night to go out with work colleagues, and oh, we didn't get home, and oh yeah, there was a conversation you wanted to have, and sort of like so there's a million ways it can go, but it is an invitation to learn more about ourselves, and also to bring that into the relationship. So, there's a really nice opportunity there to actually share with your spouse about what happens, when that whole interaction took place, and what you noticed about what happened inside you and what's going on for them. And, it's a site of being able to increase a deepening of our own understanding of ourselves and our authentic resonance, as well as an invitation to get closer to another person by sharing that part of ourselves with them and letting them provide something of what was happening for them back to us. And there's going to be difference there, and that's how difference is beautiful to me, right? Actually, sometimes there is no greater gift than getting a different perspective from someone else. It's like a thank God there's it helps us to see something that we are holding on to so certainly fall away. Now my AirPods died, so I don't know if that's going to probably make the whole thing explode. That's the difference with technology. But so I think, there's just a lot of strands from today that are coming together for me here, is all I'm trying to say.
Well, what I would take from that is maybe the one potential reward that I could anticipate from getting curious about the other is what I learn about myself. And I think that curiosity about the other ultimately is curiosity about myself. If I can't imagine being with that person, then I've just defined a limitation on my own experience. Now, of course, I could say, well, I wouldn't want to be with that other person. But if I think I can't be with the other person, which I think is often how things are defined, like, oh, they're so disgusting, their whole way of being is just so nauseous to my, well, that's a constraint I've put on myself. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that I have to enjoy it, but what nauseous situation might be the thing that I'm called upon to endure for maybe my loved one at some point in time, so yeah, I think that's really, if we've had a series of arguments, to go back to that example, how was I showing up that you wanted to argue with me, right? Like, so how would you be different if I wasn't the way I always behave around you? Maybe I would discover a part of you that I couldn't see because of my own behavior. And, it doesn't mean we have to sort of reverse, flip the tables and assume that we're in the wrong about everything. But it's really just, again, I want to go back to the word experiment, like just being open to the experiment. If I spend this evening in the non-habitual way, maybe at the end of the evening I'll say that was a waste of time, or maybe I'll say, well, now I really know why I never liked to, hang out with that crowd. But at least I went and I had the experience, rather than, there's just so much. We can't have every last experience.
But it's possible too. You're showing yourself it was possible to go there and do it too. It wasn't impossible.
Possible, yeah. And in fact, I think you can go out and come back. Let's just say it's a social thing, and it's sort of like, oh, that wasn't my favorite. Well, you know yourself better now.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not that nothing was gained, but yeah. I mean, I have to say, I appreciate the the gravity of what we're talking about this evening, just how it came about. But I think it's really necessary. And I think that the places that we run into, it feels like we're running into a wall even as we try to talk about it. That's necessary too, because then we feel that there's the wall there, and, and then maybe we need more people, or we need a ladder or something.
Yeah.
This might be a huge, well, I know it's a huge topic, but just to gesture of it, I'm thinking of some of the conversations, Daniel, you've had with Cadell, the whole idea of just bringing the question of subjectivity into science, right? So we all see things differently. So how can we nail anything down? Well, it's actually scientifically true that we all see things differently. So can we factor that in as a given? I mean, I think in a kind of a really simplistic way, we could say a lot of the problems is that we, goes back to that, doesn't everyone experience the world the way I do? Oh, they don't? Oh my God, this is shocking. And, but that really is shocking, at a certain point in your development. And you really have to get to the place of, I have no idea what it's like to be you. I was walking in the park earlier today and I saw this guy, and he was taller than me and he had a particular look on his face. And I just realized, who knows what's going on in that guy's world, But I mean, I think the mystery of it is something, as you were saying, the difference can be the source of beauty. Yeah. I mean, if we could have world peace by everyone being just like me, I don't know if that's if that's a life I'd actually really enjoy living. And that's not going to happen anyway. We're not going to flatten out difference. So how can the differences be actually a source of beauty?
Yeah, and that's a really fundamental question. And there's a particular kind of trauma that can happen to a child too, where they're supposed to be starting to learn that people have that there are different minds in the room, right? That there are two different perspectives in a room, right? When they're supposed to be starting to learn that, if their parent responds to that, negatively, their child's not allowed to have a different mind to the parent, right? If the parent is traumatized themselves, then that can be particularly troublesome to what we are talking about here, to people's ability to tolerate difference and the kind of terror that comes up to notice that someone else might hold a different, or that someone might be thinking something about me that I can't quite anticipate. There's a particular kind of nervous system dysregulation that happens with that too. But it's all linked to the same things that we're talking about here. And I keep going back to your example there, Seth, about the argument, like going to like turning up to say, speak to you guys again in the last 5 times we've argued. I just think too, like if all else fails, you could even just share that with the people, to just show up and say, the first thing you say is just, guys, we've argued every time that we've met. I really don't want to argue this time. Can we talk about it? What's going on? So you're still showing up, you're there, and you're still engaging in conversation. And if you're really not sure of much more underneath that in terms of what you want to do differently or what you could do differently, even just the invitation to be vulnerable and share what you're noticing with the other people, I think is, a practical step that you can take towards trying to do the opposite of what you might otherwise feel is your habit to do. Sorry, I've completely lost the thread there. Daniel?
I've really enjoyed this discussion, and what you were saying, I really like the example of that you're saying on the person, the husband or wife saying, "I need to talk to you this evening." I think that is a wonderful test, and I think that how one relates to that experience says a lot. And in fact, perhaps one can, as a spiritual practice, if it happens that to you, see it like fasting as an opportunity to work on your nervous system. See it as an opportunity to spend the day, today's the day of a spiritual practice. All right, I will learn to work with this. You also were mentioning this idea of kind of a couple talking about the differences they experience if you say that. And that, Michelle and I will talk about that as a meta talk, which is a talk about how we experience talking, like the self-reference move, like how I experience when you say that. Basically, our argument is marriages are in massive trouble without meta talks. And in relationships, one of the reasons why philosophy can be invaluable for relationships is because it naturally will entail meta talks, even if you don't realize it, as long as you bring it to the real, not just the history of philosophy. If the probability that an individual would be able to handle the ethical real between nation states if they haven't even done meta talks in their marriage is very low. So we will start there. So practice one. Start engaging in meta talks. Yeah, get married, be in relationships, engage in meta talks. Meta talks are step one. Really, I think they're very important. Another thing I would say, a lot of people, when we hear, don't judge the person that discuss you, don't be angry. I think most people go, I don't do that. I know people who are disgusting or whatever. I'm, pretty open to people. I think most people, when Jesus says, love your enemy, love the sinner, sit with the sinner, etc., so forth. My experience has been that most people go, yeah, I do that. Because I think we often think of the sinner as the one who made bad choices in their life or have done bad things. And we go, well, I accept people even if they've made bad, choices. That's, I'm not going to judge people or refuse to talk to them. Your enemy is the one who makes a bad choice to you, not in their past, not to others. They did it to you. And you see them as a sinner. You see them as a bad person. And everyone who is on your team agrees. And they socially support you. Mm. In your mind, anyone, what I would say, go in your mind and go through your head and ask, is there someone that I don't want to think about? I don't even want to think about them. That is the one you need to face. That is where it begins. Go through your mind. Is there someone you're like, I don't even want to think about them? Well, that's your enemy. And again, most people don't think they have enemies. Well, and I guess you have no problem talking to that person, right? Now, or facing that person. Now, again, there's a difference. And I will also make this point. I have experienced people, in Charlotte, different people who have literally been victims of abuse and different things like that. And there's working through trauma. No one is encouraging that individual to think through that. Those people need you to work through. They need to be walked through thinking with that person. So I am not suggesting that it is necessarily easy. But I have also found that there's a side of things where sometimes the person who's like literally dangerous, it's not like a bitter thing not to thank them. It's just kind of matter of fact. You're like, oh, no, I'm not going to talk with those person because it's dangerous, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the one that makes you rage up inside. We're talking about that. Mm-hmm. The other side of where you need to walk through someone to think is when they kind of get fearful and they break down. Like there's a different way the body acts. And it's very important to tell this difference. And I actually think people are now using the word trauma to refer to both of these, and they're not the same. And actually, I think people who are angry want to call what they've gone through trauma so that then they don't have to go face that person. And one must ask themselves if you're doing that. Are you doing that? Only you can know, but be very real to yourself on this. If the person that comes, if you go through your mind and there are these people that just make you go, like just that. That's who I'm talking about. Talking about that person. You need to go face that person. Mm. That's the one. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying you'll necessarily want to get dinner with them. I have no idea. This is my point. I have no idea what the outcome is. No one knows what the outcome is. Don't worry about the outcome. Do it. That's the social mysticism. That's the unknown. That's the willingness to enter into a place. I don't know. I believe the very willingness to do that changes you. It makes you courageous. It works on your nervous system. It changes you. If you are willing to do that, and you do that, regardless what the outcome is, no one can take that from you. And you can't take it from yourself. So I think that's a practice to start.
Yeah. And it already requires the holding of the complexity,
Yes, ma'am.
the loving act towards oneself and a loving act towards another.
Absolutely.
All right, should we draw it to a close? Nice to notice that we didn't argue this time. I know we argued the last 5 times.
Oh yeah, always, constantly. I tell you what.
There's always next time.
I thank you both.